Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This training is the Fair Housing Deep Dive for maintenance professionals. So if this is what you were expecting and you're here, congrats, welcome. Um, we have a great presentation lined up for you guys today. Just a few housekeeping before we get started here. Attendance will be taken through the training evaluation and attendance verification survey. This will be provided at the end of the training. It should automatically appear in your browser as well. This survey must be completed by tomorrow by 5 p.m. To ensure that you receive a certificate if that is what you are looking for. We can't guarantee certificates if it is not completed after that date or if you don't complete it. All attendees are muted. We cannot hear you or see you. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature. If questions are asked in the chat, they may be missed. So please use that Q&A session. We have a lot of people logging on today. We had over 400 people registered, so we're really happy that you're here today. In addition, this training is being recorded, and it is sponsored by a generous grant from Mishta, which we are really thankful for. So welcome. My name is Brianna Miranda. I am the Education and Outreach Coordinator, and joined today with me is Liz Keegan, the Director of Education and Outreach, and behind the scenes, who's working on some technical assistance. So if you have issues, is Lindsay Owens, and they are also the other Education and Outreach Coordinator in our department. We are with the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan, and here's some of our contact information. Feel free to follow us on any of these platforms and visit our website. Today, we will be talking about kind of who we are as the Fair Housing Center. We'll go over some laws, go over the state of housing discrimination, go over criminal background, reasonable accommodations and modifications, harassment, retaliation, and then end with some best practices and tools and resources. And then, of course, we'll take questions, some clarifying questions as we can, but we'll try to address all detailed questions at the end. If not, you can always email us. But first off, we're going to test you bright and early this morning, test your knowledge with a poll. These are anonymous and it's not really graded or anything like that. So that should appear. The first question on there is, on a scale of 1 to 5, what is your level of fair housing experience? So an easy one. The first one being I am new, middle, I am familiar, and then 5, I know a lot. There's no judgment there. We understand a lot of people have differing levels, and we're just interested to see how experienced or not experienced you guys are. The second one there, anyone can file a fair housing complaint, a resident, a visitor, a property manager, true or false. And the last one, maintenance staff cannot be held responsible for stating a preference for certain types of tenants under fair housing laws, true or false. I'll give a few minutes here to answer these questions. If you're attending as a group, feel free to make a consensus as a team. Again, this isn't graded or anything, so don't worry about that.
So we have a question about how to answer the questions. So you should be able to individually select your responses. And if you scroll down, you should be able to submit responses to all 3 questions. And I think there's a button at the bottom where you can submit your answers. But as Bree said, it's not anything you need to worry about in terms of participation. We just like to offer a little bit of interaction. So even if you can't answer them, that's okay. Hopefully that's helpful. We don't get to see exactly what you can see, so
Our screen's a little bit different.
yeah. But it looks like we have a real mix of different levels of experience, which is always nice to see. So if you're new, welcome. And if you've got a lot of experience, thank you for coming back.
Yeah, we hope you, if you're attended our trainings a lot, hopefully we'll say some new things and yeah, be helpful.
New cases, new
Give about,
laws, lots to talk about.
yeah, I'll give about 30 more seconds here. All right, get your last minute choices in. Again, there's no penalty for not answering, so if you don't get them in, that's all right. You can just follow along with us. All right. Going to share the results so you guys can all see what the different variations of levels there. So yeah, like Liz said, there is varying levels of people here. So welcome. A lot of people that are familiar, which is really great because we'll go over fair housing, but we're not going to go in depth. So if you've attended our 101, we're not going to go that deep. The second one, anyone can file a fair housing complaint. That is true. We do often get housing providers or staff reporting on and really monitoring the market for us as well, which is really great. We have a lot of great housing provider partners. And the last one, maintenance staff cannot be held responsible for stating a preference for certain types of tenants under fair housing laws. That is false. Maintenance staff can be held responsible. Anybody that is in the housing uh, employed by a housing provider can be held responsible for stating a preference. And even if there can be neighbor on neighbor harassment, those folks can also be held under fair housing laws. It's a good job. Though the majority of people got those correct. So who are we? At the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan, our mission is to prevent and eliminate illegal housing discrimination, ensure equal housing opportunity, and promote inclusive communities. We do this through a variety of ways. One way right now is through education. We also provide education to the housing consumers, so people that are looking for housing on knowing their fair housing rights, but we do provide education housing providers like this. We do outreach, we do research, and then we do some advocacy and enforcement for claims of housing discrimination. We were founded in 1980 as a private nonprofit organization. So, as I'll share in a little bit, there are other fair housing centers around the state, but we all are guided by our own boards and we're our own independent nonprofits. Just as a note, we cannot provide any legal advice. We have no attorneys or lawyers on staff. All information provided today is for educational purposes only. Additionally, all information is current and to the best of our knowledge, but could change at any time. We are not the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan. We are not an enforcement authority. We lead with education and we try to seek to prevent housing discrimination whenever possible. As noted in the poll, anyone can report housing discrimination, and our services are free and they help, and our clients help lead our process. So we let our clients lead what they want to see as an outcome. As I mentioned, there are additional fair housing centers across the state. They are linked there in your handouts. Just as a note, if you did not receive the handouts email from Lindsay yesterday or this morning, feel free to put your email in the chat so those can be sent out. And then this is kind of the service area for the Fair Housing Centers. As you can see, we are in the teal area, and we cover half of Allegan County, all the way up, and the UP. Additionally, those in the orange are friends at the Fair Housing Center of Southeast Mid-Michigan. Don't provide as much education to the housing industry. So folks in that area additionally do call us, and we do provide support as we can, as we have capacity. Some things that we don't do, because fair is a very subjective word, and folks sometimes confuse our work with other housing options in the community. We do not provide counseling on landlord-tenant. We do not teach home buyer classes. We do not teach credit counseling or strictly work on affordable housing issues, although they are intertwined. We do not address building codes or maintenance issues if equal service is being provided. That is the key there. And then we also do not do any foreclosure prevention. So, what is fair housing? Some of you are new, so I'm going to go over this really briefly. But fair housing is the right to have obtain housing free from unlawful discrimination, and it's based on the individual's choice. It is defined by protected classes, which are under federal, state, and local laws, and we'll go over those in the next slide here. Um, we also can think of protected classes as protected characteristics, so they're characteristics of people. It protects against discrimination in any type of housing transaction, which includes maintenance. And that's really great while you guys are here today. But it can really be anything from rentals to lending to insurance to vacant land that is intended for housing is covered by fair housing. So our protected classes here, we have at the federal level, so across the whole United States, we have race, color, so skin color, national origin, where somebody is from, sex, religion, disability status, including both mental and physical disabilities, and familial status, which is the presence of children under the age of 18 in the home. Additionally, for federally funded properties, we do have the HUD equal access rule. It still stands as is. And those are the additional protected classes covered there for federally funded properties. At the state level, we have additional protected classes. So if you are located outside the state of Michigan, you will need to check on your state's protected classes to ensure that you're meeting those and following those. In addition, here in Michigan, we have marital status, which is whether or not somebody's married, single, divorced, widowed. That should not change access to housing. Age, with some exceptions of senior housing, so 55 and older, and 62 and older. And then sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression were newly added and went into effect last year. And then a new one that we'll be talking about today a little bit, I think, is source of income, which will be effective next week. So folks cannot be discriminated against based on these protected classes in Michigan. And then locally, it depends. We have a lot of people from various localities and municipalities here today, so we really didn't list them out. Feel free to check them out at those different links there to make sure that you're following your city's um, locally protected classes. And if do maintenance on multiple properties, making sure you're aware of those protected classes within those multiple properties if they fall into different cities or townships.
Yeah, and if I can just say, Bree, especially for those of you who are new, I think one of the best ways to get familiar with fair housing is to develop your list of protected classes and just kind of have that in your mind. Or if you're a paper person, pen and paper like me, make note of that so that you have the ability to kind of cross-reference. If you find yourself talking about how something you're doing or a policy would impact families with children, for example, or might have an impact on persons with disabilities, that should trigger the recall, these are protections under fair housing. We should think about this from a fair housing lens, maybe do some research. So there's some gray areas under fair housing law, which we certainly understand, but I think one of the best ways to get comfortable with and use fair housing is to really know what your protected classes are. So if you're not familiar with that, I think it's a great idea, as Bree said, to kind of do all that homework and develop your list and get familiar with it.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. So going over in back in 2023, race was expanded upon under the Michigan Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act, which is Michigan's civil rights law that says what our protected classes are, and it extended the definition of race to include hair texture and protective hairstyles. And this is called the Crown Act. So in addition to those race protections at the federal level, Michigan goes a little step further to ensure that hairstyles associated with race are also protected. And this came out of an education case where a child's hair was cut off by a teacher. We are seeing these come across the United States in different areas. Additionally, we have the gender identity or expression and sexual orientation also added at the same time, but it did go into effect last February. And gender identity or expression means having or being perceived as having a gender-related self-identity, whether or not it's associated with an individual's assigned sex at birth. And then sexual orientation is just having an orientation of heterosexuality, homosexuality, or bisexuality, or having a history or being identified as such. And as we've talked about in some of our past classes, is even if somebody assumes a protected class about you and then discriminates with that assumption, that is still protected under fair housing. Um, and then our new law, our source of income law that it will go into effect next week, is both amended under the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act and the Landlord Tenant Act, and it protects income across the board. So any legal verifiable income, which includes housing assistance, housing vouchers, Social Security, SSI. Really any kind of money that can be administered by a federal, state, or local entity um, should be counted as income. So that is really the importance of this law is that if income is coming in that is not our standard, what we think of income, that those other types of income are being counted as income when somebody is applying, and people are not being treated differently based on the type of income that they receive. It does provide an exemption for landlords with less than 5 units in Michigan, and the housing agency is tasked with approving vouchers within 30 days. So kind of looking at the state of fair housing here, 83% of national fair housing complaints in 2023 did take place in the rental process. So we do see that there is um, a high level of complaints coming from the rental industry. And so it's really important that you guys are here today and that people are getting educated because fair housing isn't required by law as an education. So it's really important and really great that you guys are here today because it isn't a legal requirement for you guys to have this education. So we really thank you for being here today. And then looking at our center's allegations in 2024, disability was our number one allegation. We had 168 allegations total. Across the board, which included 142 cases. However, we received over 300 actual complaints. We just were able to move forward with 168 of those based on different levels of information given. If people were able to kind of complete the complaint. We understand that housing and moving can be very stressful, so that may just fall to the backboard, which is totally fine. So yeah, disability status was our number one complaint in 2024, and it has been up there for almost, I think, a decade. I think it might be a decade this year of 10 years of having disability status allegations as our number one, followed by race and color. And then new last year, national origin cases were on the rise. In the past, it was always disability, race, color, and familial status, and sometimes they would flop around throughout our time as a center. And then again, looking at our cases by transaction, as noted, the National Fair Housing Center or the National Fair Housing Alliance found that rental was the highest across the board. That is also our case for cases, and followed by reasonable accommodations, which we will cover, which is somebody seeking a change in policy based on their disability. And then our next little, I would say it's rising, is harassment and mortgage. And then we have some sales as well there. So going in now to criminal background screening. In 2016, HUD issued some guidance that kind of clarified some information on criminal background screening, and then additional guidance in 2022 on how to evaluate applicants with criminal background. So those are linked there. Having a criminal background or record is not a federally protected class. However, there are some things that HUD has provided as guidance to ensure that you're treating people with criminal backgrounds uh, equitably, because as noted here, 100 million U.S. adults, or nearly a third of the population, have some type of criminal record, which is very significant. Um, the 2022 guidance kind of outlines three different ways that you can kind of have liability under the Fair Housing Act. So discriminatory intent, which means, somebody meant to discriminate, having discriminatory effects. So a policy is neutral on its face. However, it negatively impacts a protected class. Kind of we see that often maybe with occupancy policies, maybe if they're over restrictive. They may be neutral on the face, but they impact, families with children or marital status. And then the last one there is the refusal to make reasonable accommodations, which we will cover in our disability section. But folks with criminal records can make reasonable accommodation request if their criminal record is related to a disability. Notably, the guidance does cite research that says criminal history is not a good predictor of housing success, and it says that housing providers should consider not using criminal history to screen for tenants, since it doesn't really show if somebody is a good tenant or not, and whether or not they have a criminal background. So that's just a suggestion by HUD. However, there are some examples that they share on disparate treatment. So, not advising to all applicants of the policy, so ensuring everyone knows of the policy the same, not applying it to everyone, rejecting comparatively qualified applicants based on criminal records. So if you have two people that are applying and they have the same criminal record, but you accept one person but not the other, and the person that was accepted was white and the other person was black or brown, that would show that there is a disparate impact there based on race. Another one would be discouraging some protected applicants and encouraging others, or offering applications and withholding it from others. So again, that difference in treatment based on criminal background, kind of picking and choosing. It really should be applied equally across the board. These are some examples that were in the 2022 guidance. A housing provider evicts a Latinx tenant who was convicted of a crime, but did not evict a white tenant who was convicted of a similar crime. So kind of going back to one of those that I listed or talked about in the previous slide, having they both have the same criminal record, but race was the only difference in which they were evicted. After learning that an applicant was previously homeless and hospitalized for treatment of a mental health condition, a management company departed from its procedures and conducted a criminal background screening of the applicant. So after this person was, they've already were living there, and they kind of deferred from their standard procedures and then did a criminal background screening. Some best practices here, avoiding third-party screening companies that use biased algorithms. We will talk about a new guidance that came out through HUD about AI and third-party screening. But essentially, these screening companies don't do individualized assessments, which is a best practice, which can be really concerning. They just kind of send you a yes or a no without really considering other factors, which is really important when considering criminal background. Having a written criminal background policy that is available to everyone is really a really great best practice. Delay considering criminal background after you verify the other qualifications. So if they meet all of the other qualifications, you should factor those in before you even look at criminal history. If they have the income and they have the credit score and all the other things that you have as a policy, maybe look at that criminal history a little bit, after that. And then make sure you're treating comparable criminal histories similarly. Moving on to the 2024 HUD guidance, they did issue two different kind of documents. One addressing the tenant screening process, which we'll kind of go over a little bit, and then an advertising and using online platforms as ads. We won't really won't go into that one, so feel free to review that. It is linked there. The 2012 guidance on screening really discusses how housing providers and companies can screen applicants in a non-discriminatory way. There are best practices recommended in there, and it really applies to all the housing decisions, regardless of what technology is used. So, and it really is trying to get at housing providers and screening companies. So, really evaluating what is being used and what technology is being used when screening applicants for criminal history.
Yeah, so can I jump in, Bree? Is that okay? So as you said, this really isn't too new. It's going to build on the 2022 guidance that you just reviewed. And so really these six guiding principles are really not anything new. We want any policies in place to be focusing on relevant screening criteria to keeping your people and your property safe. Only accurate criminal background records should be used. There's a lot of flawed data, a lot of bad information out there, incomplete records out there. So as Bree said, it's really important to have that individualized assessment and really look at each record carefully to make sure it's accurate information. Of course, you've heard us say, many of you, many times, follow your policies, have it, give it out to people, use it yourself, and follow it across the board. Something that it does encourage, which I think, as Bree said, is really beneficial, is being transparent. Having people understand what standards they're being held to, being able to see and hold the policy, have it for themselves. They better understand what they are needing to address in terms of maybe making changes, or if they have information they can share with you that might change the outcome of accessing the housing. It just makes sense. And really that exchange of information, allowing applicants to challenge any negative information with additional detail, can really help provide equitable access. And then, of course, any groups that are actually using these third-party screening companies, or if they're developing and running them themselves, they need to be keeping fair housing compliance in mind as well. And then there's just a couple additional considerations from this newer guidance. And it just raises a lot of really good questions. One being credit history. A lot of housing providers use credit scores as a standard. And that's not what credit scoring was developed to do. It was really assessing somebody's likeliness to default on a loan. It wasn't about whether they were going to consistently pay their bills like utilities or rent. So what are we trying to get at there with that? We want to know, are they going to pay their rent? So is there another way we can look at that? And one alternative is simply verifying that they have the income available to pay their rent. We also better understand evictions and eviction history and eviction data. It's very flawed, a lot of incomplete data out there. The records aren't great. So things to think about is, what do we need to know about the eviction to find out if they can be a good tenant now? What's changed? What happened back then? Why did it happen? Was it long ago, or do those circumstances no longer apply? Did they get a promotion, a different job, a higher education degree? There's so many things that can inform that story. So there's an opportunity, I think, to really visit these two very common areas where people experience housing barriers, especially as we look at a record housing shortage. And then we'll kind of finish up going back to the 2022 HUD guidance on criminal records. So I'll turn it back over to you, Bree. But these are just considerations that they raise that I think are very common barriers, and it's interesting to see them being addressed. Nothing firm, no recommendations, but some recommendations that could be considered.
Yeah. Thanks, Liz. Yeah, so going back to the 22 best practices, kind of going back to like everything Liz was talking about, really doing a individualized assessment and really only evicting somebody for criminal activity as a last resort, denying an applicant or evicting them, and giving them the opportunity to correct the information or explain their situation is really important, and something HUD has outlined as a best practice, and never really evict anyone for or family because they're victims of a crime. So that's a really important one that I don't think we often think about when we're thinking about criminal background is the people that are affected, in addition to, the person committing the crime. Do not ban a tenant's invited guest from visiting based on the guest's criminal involvement. And just make sure we talk about this a lot in all of our trainings, but document any of the screening completed, any of the information given, and the decisions that were made. It goes on to talk about some more best practices when it comes to policies. Again, considering the nature and the severity, it's a felony or a misdemeanor, the recency of the criminal conduct. Is it a danger to the people and property? Is it been, 20 years since somebody has committed a crime? Just ensure that the policy is justified with evidence to show that it really is protecting residents. That is the goal of any criminal background policy is you're making sure your other residents are safe or your property is safe. Um, don't avoid automatic denials or blanket bans. So anything that says no felonies, no exceptions, that type of stuff is not a best practice. And it really should not be considering arrests because, yeah, that's not a confirmed crime that has been done. Consider the amount of time that has been passed as well. Like I talked about, the recency of it. Again, just really make sure you're providing an individualized assessment with the information that you know, and the recency, the age of the individual at the time of the conduct. Were they a kid and now they're, a 40-year-old person? That a lot has changed since then. And then also consider, rehabilitation efforts. Have they gone to a program? Have they been hospitalized? Is there things that they've done to really improve their situation? And then, as I mentioned, if there are requests for reasonable accommodations, those need to be considered on the basis of disability. So I have another pop quiz here for you. How long, I'm going to get it queued up here, but how long should you keep maintenance records? 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, forever, or you don't need to keep them. All right, and then you should be able to answer now. Give folks about 30 seconds to a minute. See how fast you guys are answering it.
There's some lightning quick responses.
Yeah. Give about 20-ish, 30 seconds here. You guys are quick to the draw.
And I suppose we should specify you can have your own policy, but this is how long you want to keep your records from a fair housing perspective. Always know what your policies are at the office and make sure you follow those. But from our perspective, we're looking
Yeah.
for a minimum.
And if your policy differs to what the answer we will reveal, maybe consider talking to your management to just kind of say, hey, like I learned this. Should we change our policy?
Might be time to update. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're updating a lot of things with some of the new protections that are coming online. And so we are in the same boat where we are updating all of our materials, our websites, everything that we can get our hands on.
All right, I ended the poll there, and I'm going to share the answer. It was really spread out, but 5 years was the average, or the majority of you picked that. And our answer is 3 or more years. So that's based on um, statute of limitations, really. And then, so up to there's cases can be filed up to 3 years. So having that documentation is just really important to show, did you follow a policy? Was there any wrongdoing? Things like that. So if folks do have a 5-year policy, that is a-okay. It's really 3 or more years.
In Michigan, I should specify as well. That's the
Yes.
statute of limitations to bring a fair housing claim in Michigan courts. So for those of you outside of the state, that might be another homework assignment for you to check out. But that's the longest window we have in the state of Michigan.
Thank you for that clarification. So now we're going to move on to disability status. So, disability, as I mentioned earlier, covers both mental and physical disabilities, and it is defined as a mental or physical impairment that limits a major life activity, or having a record of such, or being regarded as such. As I kind of mentioned, if people assume you have a disability, you are protected, even if you don't. A major life activity is really anything that affects your life, as the name suggests, but sleeping, walking, eating, bathing, driving, hearing, seeing, just anything that can get you through life. If that's affected, it's really covered under disability. So it's pretty broad under the Fair Housing Act. There are two opportunities that people with disabilities can utilize to ensure that they have enjoyment of their housing. And one of them is modifications, and the other is accommodations. And we'll dive deeper into both of them. But those joint statements right there are really great for, they have a lot of good Q&A type questions in there. So it's always great to review those. We often refer to those when folks are reaching out asking questions. So modifications are the structural change or physical change to a unit to ensure that a person has access. So oftentimes we do think of this as a ramp to a building's entrance, maybe grab bars in the bathroom, changing the handles to a level versus a doorknob. That image on the far left, the bevel was changed. The person had to line themselves up directly and then kind of launch themselves in. They were in a wheelchair. I should have mentioned that. They were in a wheelchair. And so there was just a tiny lip, but they had to launch themselves at the door to get over that lip. So that they did request a modification to kind of get that beveled ledge so they could easily glide into that unit. I do have another poll for you before I move into the uh, to a case. True or false, you can require that modifications be restored to their original condition at the end of the lease. And let me get that pulled up. Sorry, my computer is lagging just a tad. All right, that should be up on your screen now. True or false? You have about 30, the other 30 seconds here. Get your last second choices in. Wonderful. And the majority of you got that correct. You can require that modification be restored at the end of a lease. That is something a housing provider can do. So great job. So this case here is out of Michigan. It was in July of 2019. Donald Davenport applied for an apartment in Oakland County. Him and his wife were moving to be near family, as Mr. Davenport had a neuro degenerative disorder, progressive supranuclear palsy, PSP, as we'll just call it. They found two ground level apartments in Holly, Michigan that were perfect for him, and they were within walking distance of his stepdaughter and his additional caretaker, Kathy. They immediately took action and they put down a deposit, and they asked permission then to install structurally sound grab bars in the shower for him, and they even offered to pay for it. They knew that this was a necessity for his disability, as it was a progressive degenerative disorder, so they knew that this was helpful for him. PSP hinders mobility and affects physical and mental capacities, and he was susceptible to be stumbling and limiting his muscle control. Sometimes his eye would fix in one position, limiting his ability to see and react. And he would always need some form of assistance to move around, if that was a walker or a wheelchair. So it was really important for him to have a ground level unit that was flat. There was no stairs, no carpet, as he, may need a wheelchair at some point or a walker, but those wheels, he needed something that was level. And then additionally, those grab bars he needed drilled in so he could shower independently and safely stand to get clean. He wasn't at the point where he needed assistance during showering, and he still wanted to maintain that level of independence. So those grab bars would allow him to do that. His previous housing had accommodated this disability by maintenance staff following the installation instructions and securely fastening them by drilling screws into the studs behind the shower wall and using a sealant around the metal plates. So it was doable. This did provide, again, Mr. Davenport the own ability to have, take his own shower. And they did not cause any leaks. This is really important to note. Um, they did meet with the head of maintenance, who showed them two accessible units on the ground floor. So when they found those two units, it was a maintenance staff person who kind of led the tour. There were no curb barriers, no steps in front, no internal stairs. So it was absolutely perfect, exactly what they needed. They applied and again requested permission from the regional manager, who said they would need to check with maintenance, but accepted all the fees and everything and gave them a move-in date. So the manager was ready to move them in. And then they did get an email to approve them, but the manager had said they spoke to maintenance and the only grab bars they would approve were unsecured suction cup bars. And she even acknowledged, the manager, that they're not as sturdy, which was important to need, was the sturdiness of the grab bars. They further expressed that the drill and grab bars would leak or hold pockets of water. However, suction cup grab bars were dangerous for him, as his specific disability needed the stability. The family addressed these concerns about leakage. They talked about what the previous housing provider did. Some tubs have tub surrounds and not fiberglass, and this gave concerns about where the wooden stubs are located in addition to the fiberglass surrounded. She stated that the maintenance man was not on the property and could not recall the upcoming unit's bathroom walls. And she said she would speak with the supervisor. So they were really just kind of giving them the runaround on it, even though they had provided enough information to say this would work.
Yeah. And the manager was like remote, never met them, was off site. And so the maintenance staff were the frontline staff representing the housing opportunity and had toured them through, showed them everything that they were looking for, and then kind of had a secondary reframing of the message, and then couldn't recall the units that he had shown somehow. So
the complex then just stopped communicated and rented to other individuals without disabilities who paid their deposits after the Davenport. So as we remember, they had accepted all of their money, gave them approval, and they just stopped communicating with them because they needed this modification. It was filed as a federal court lawsuit, where the apartment complex refused the reasonable modification request, and the suction grab bars were insufficient. The apartment complex did deny liability, and the parties were able to reach a settlement that included placing an anti-discrimination policy on the complex's website. They were required to have fair housing training and a disability rights notice on the application. However, in the end, the Davenports had to move to an apartment that was less accessible, was more expensive, and it was farther away from Miss Sullivan. So really, in the end, unfortunately, the Davenports really paid the price for this reasonable modification denial.
yeah, I think this case really shows something as simple as grab bars can have significant ripple effects on the day-to-day impact and the major life activities, that you mentioned, Bree. This is one of our more simple requests that can get made. It's not regrading a front yard or building a ramp or widening doorways. It's the installation of grab bars. So, and we share this case example too because it shows that different staff responsibilities can involve showing or touring properties or being kind of that frontline person who is really representing access to the housing. And everybody has that liability. So it's really important to be aware of. And from the maintenance perspective, being able to recognize these types of requests and take action because they're quite likely going to come to you and your team members first, as in this case.
Yeah, and I really think it shows the harm of not, just considering and, really doing the work on understanding a modification request or an accommodation request.
Yeah, they take homework, and that's okay.
And that is something also the HUD guidance does, talk about is, having reasonable time to, do research and, you can be reasonable in your process and ensuring that you're doing things appropriately and you can do it. Um, we do have some videos here. Let me check the time, see if we have time for them.
Yes, I think we're good.
Yeah, we're good on time. So I'm going to show a couple videos here. This was a training that was held by another fair housing center, really kind of just showing regular people, regular people with not disabilities, how people with disabilities function in the world. So the first one we have here is they did a training and they kind of had the simulation of using doors with a wheelchair. You can kind of see how it's really a struggle to, line yourself up in a door.
And there's a real small threshold there. You really you can't quite see, but it's a little lip essentially. But if you don't have the momentum and as you said, be perfectly aligned, it can be quite challenging. And look how close the door was to her elbows and hands. Versus this one is much wider and has no threshold, plenty of space to clear and turn and move through.
And then the other one here is a ramp station.
No, you're gonna wheel yourself up there. Very nice. You wheel yourself up. I'm not gonna let you fall back. Okay. We put that up to show you an example. It doesn't see how hard that one is. You don't have to look at dust. Yep. Okay. I'm gonna lay you down now. You're gonna go to the other side.
And this one is showing, I
Right.
believe, the level of incline of a ramp.
Alright, so I'm gonna turn you here. This is just so
And how easy or not easy it is to kind of move yourself.
because of the expansion, it's designed to be like a volleyball or something like that.
Sorry, it's
See how much
freezing.
easier it is? I know, isn't it? Well, that's what the whole empathy thing's about.
Unit is not going to work in this stuff because it needs to expand.
There you go.
So yeah, we just wanted to show that video to really help you guys understand, maybe the difficulties that people with disabilities may have when navigating spaces that, if we're not using a wheelchair, that may seem easy for us to use.
And something with the ramp station that comes to mind, something that I've learned that has stuck with me. For every inch of height that you're looking to go up, you need a foot of ramp. And so that first very short ramp that she couldn't even get up went up very quickly and was clearly not to code, which is another issue. We want to make sure anything that's built or installed is safe and passes local code for building and construction standards. But an inch of height equals a foot of ramp. And so that's really important to make sure that anything that's built has that, meets that threshold.
Yeah, so what are the things that you should be thinking about, asking yourselves when assessing a reasonable modification? Thinking about who will use it. Will there be any issues? Like Liz kind of just talked about, is there code compliance? Things that you have to consider. Do you need documentation? If the person, has a visible, sorry, visible disability, then you really don't need that documentation. If they're in a wheelchair, you don't need documentation to say they need a ramp. You can see they need a ramp, but some disabilities are invisible, and documentation may be needed, which is appropriate to ask for. Um, do you need some plans or drawings? This is a little bit more complex than just installing a bevel. Is there more to it? And then also thinking about who pays for it. This really goes back to how is the property funded. And so if you're a federally funded property, the housing provider pays for it. But if you're a private housing provider, the tenant generally pays for it. But there are some gray areas, and if you have any questions on those, always feel free to reach out to us. And the other question, what happens when the tenant moves out? As we talked about, or as our poll question, you can request it be um, m- re put back to its original state. However, if it's something that you think would be beneficial, maybe you don't want it to be, you know, put back to the original state. But all of it requires homework, and that is something, again, we can help with.
There's a high demand for accessible features in housing right now, and there will continue to be as we, as a population, age for sure.
Yeah. We have another poll question here. We're really testing your guys' knowledge today and this morning. So our question here, you don't have to do anything if you feel a request for a modification should be declined. True or false? Give about a minute here for folks to answer it. Again, if you're in a group, you may have to discuss a little if needed. All right, give another 10 seconds. Most people have answered, but let those last people make their decisions. All right. The majority of you got this correct. The answer is false. It's really important to involve your supervisor, consider other alternatives. That is noted in the guidance that other alternatives need to be recommended. Thinking about if there's any undue or financial administrative burdens, there's things to process about it. So make sure that you're doing that thing, involving your supervisor, and then document, as we always note. It's a good job there. Now moving on to reasonable accommodations, which are the changes in any rules, policies, or procedures that you as the housing provider have that a person with a disability needs to also have equal access and enjoyment of their housing. Some common ones that we see as obtaining assigned accessible parking. We understand that there are spaces required under ADA, which is not, that's a law for people with disabilities. The public access, fair housing covers, the housing aspect of it. So these are separate from those parking spaces. So a person can request a reserved parking space if needed for their disability. If the policy is a no pet policy, waiving that policy for a person with an assistance animal, allowing a live-in aid or home supports if there's maybe a no guests rule, or if there's only allowed one key per household. Maybe they need a accommodation to have an additional key made for their live-in aid. Allowing time for hoarding assistance services to bring a unit up to lease compliance. That is another one that most people don't think about, but hoarding is considered a disability. So if a person is trying to work on it, allowing them to have that time to do so. Uh, this is a case out of Georgia. So this case alleges that a housing property management company and its employees and a condo unit prohibited a hearing impaired resident from using a service animal in their unit. They were aware that the person was deaf. She did request a reasonable accommodation for her service dog named Lady. After she entered the rental agreement, staff responded, "What is your dog trained to do?" They told her dog is a hearing dog and is trained to let me know who is at the door. She also lets me know about my surroundings. So one of the things that they did know that she was deaf. So it was important that they didn't ask for documentation or anything, which they didn't do, which is great. That night, her car was broken into, and she did not hear the police or her housemates knocking on her door to alert her. She requested again to have the RA because she didn't feel safe without her animal. So she was living without her hearing dog during this time because she kept requesting it and they weren't approving it. But she did not feel safe because she didn't have her animal there to wake her up in case of emergencies. They then didn't accept her documentation that she provided. They just had a blanket policy of not accepting any ESAs, which is emotional service animal. They then requested a doctor's note, which I just noted they knew she was deaf. And they noted that the training was not required but would be helpful. That wasn't what her dog, it wasn't required that her dog have additional training. And they also didn't offer an alternative, which is called out again, as I noted in the HUD guidance. They then submitted another RA request through the maintenance portal this time for a flashing doorbell. Kind of like, okay, if you're not going to accept my service animal, here's another thing. The complainant actually came up with another alternative. But then that request was never addressed. They submitted documentation, a physician's letter, vaccination records. They met with a request for a card to show the animal as a service animal. That she really went beyond what is required of a person with an assistance animal. She even got a certified. They further requested a certified training document. They required leashing and the dog to remain with her when she left at all times. They told her their home didn't fall under ADA, which I just discussed is the
Americans with Disabilities Act.
Thank you. Americans with Disability Act, but it addresses public accommodations and public access for people with disabilities. So yeah, it didn't, but it fell under fair housing.
Anytime you're asking for an assistance animal in housing, whether it's a service dog or emotional support, you use the Fair Housing Act to assess that request. So they tried all kinds of things that were not appropriate.
Yeah, ultimately the resident moved out because she did not feel safe. She couldn't, live, have equal enjoyment of her home with a person with a disability. And then as a result, HUD is alleging actual damages, economic loss of housing opportunity, and an emotional distress. Here's another case out of Michigan where a tenant turned away maintenance staff after they were trying to do a non-emergency repair, but this tenant was actually in labor for high-risk pregnancy and was needing to get to the hospital. So really, understandably so, why she turned away maintenance staff. That was not where her mind was. But upon returning, she found a notice to quit on her door. And the reason listed was a lease violation for refusing maintenance. The local fair housing center who took this case on advised, well, maybe make a reasonable accommodation request. Submit proof that you went into labor and that you had a high-risk pregnancy. But after doing so, the housing provider still pursued eviction anyway, even after receiving the accommodation request. The housing provider then continued to bother the tenant to really try to catch her in a lease violation. At a meeting with the Fair Housing Center, the housing provider offered to dismiss the eviction if the tenant moved out, which obviously she declined because why would she move out if she had a home that fit her needs? The housing provider then took her to court 4 times and only dismissed the eviction once a fair housing suit was filed, which is just really showing that they were never intended to want to work with this tenant. Despite loving the location and everything, the tenant did move away to protect herself and her new family and her emotional health. She was one of the things that I'm, just now thinking about, like she was getting bothered, but she had a newborn baby. She just gave birth. That wasn't something that she needed. The additional stress wasn't necessary, especially having a high risk pregnancy. There can be complications after birth as well. Um, and then so again, what are some questions here that you can ask yourselves when evaluating accommodation requests? What does your current policy say? What are your standard procedures and how is this request different? Is there documentation needed again? When or how does the policy get changed? Again, all of these require homework. Some of these you can, address with your supervisors and your other coworkers, but in the end, if you still have questions, we can always answer those questions for you. I have
So,
another.
oh,
Oh, go
sorry.
ahead.
We just had a quick question that I wanted to address, but let's do the quiz and then we'll go back. Sorry.
Okay. So we have another pop quiz here. What should you do quiz? What should you do? A tenant makes a verbal reasonable accommodation request to you and explains their disability while you are working in the unit on a separate maintenance request. Choose all that apply. Ignore them. Let the tenant know that you cannot take a reasonable accommodation request. Tell the tenant they must submit the accommodation in writing, no exceptions. Make note of the request and relay it to the office staff for follow-up. This one is a little bit more deeper of a question. So I'll give a little bit more time on this, probably a minute and a half or so. Check the time, but about a minute and a half. About 20 more seconds here. Again, if you can't get it in before I end it, um, you know, it's we just want you thinking about these things. These are things that come up. These are things that people ask us about, and just thinking about best practices here. All right, I'm gonna end the poll here. The majority of you did select the correct answer. There's a little, we'll talk about that a little bit more. So the best practice would to be make note of the request and relay it to the office staff for follow-up. Some issues with the previous ones, obviously ignoring them is not a best practice, as we'll talk about. They can be accepted. Reasonable accommodation modification requests can be made verbally and or in writing at any time, and they should be accepted as such. And as maintenance staff, you may be getting some of these if you're actively in the units, as this whole situation kind of laid out. Letting them know you cannot take a reasonable accommodation request really isn't a best practice because, again, they can make them at any time. You can relay that like, oh, I'm going to make a note of this and relay it to the office staff for follow-up. That is, again, going back to that last one, is really the best practice. And then tell them that they must submit it in writing, no exceptions. Again, they can request those at any time. So that isn't a best practice. But good job. That was a tricky one. especially if this is new to you. Some of you said you're just familiar with it. So that was a little bit more of an advanced question. So again, the process, they can be made at any time, in any way, and they should be accepted and addressed as such. Once that mention of a disability and a disability-related need is brought up, that is them making it. It doesn't have to be a formal request, because a lot of people don't know the terminology. They just know, oh, I need this because of my disability. And then making sure they're evaluated and decided on a case-by-case basis. And then reasonable modifications also should be allowed in for most of the time. There's really very small scenarios that wouldn't be accepted, but so because it's really just the housing provider granting permission to allow them to happen, again, something has to be structurally sound and things like that. But for the most part, those should be accepted. I see Liz.
Okay, I have a couple questions before we talk about how to assess requests. So if I can just pop in right here. We had a question about, do we have to accept emotional support animals and what constitutes appropriate documentation to evaluate the request? And the general answer is if a person can verify that they are a person with a disability and have a disability-related need for any accommodation or modification, including assistance animals, then yes, they generally must be allowed. In terms of what's appropriate documentation, it can be a multitude of things, and that's addressed in some of the guidance. But it can be a letter from a healthcare professional, it can be a letter from a therapist, someone who is familiar with their disability and their disability-related needs. So there's a variety of sources that can provide those letters, but for assistance animals specifically, there's some HUD guidance that recommends a healthcare professional who is familiar with their needs. And then another follow-up about it, if there is a weight limit on service animals or emotional support animals. So very quickly, pets are not the same as assistance animals. So you may have pet policies that do have weight limits or breed limitations. That's another follow-up question. You can define or limit pets as much as you want. However, those pet policies cannot be applied to assistance animals at all. Assistance animals cannot be subject to breed restrictions. Assistance animals cannot be subject to weight limits either. So hopefully that's helpful. But those were a couple of detailed questions that I wanted to get into.
Yeah, and they're pretty common. We get those questions a lot. We do have a lot of guidance on that, and we have a recorded video on our YouTube that addresses some common assistance animal questions. So if that is a big area that you have questions in, please feel free to watch that video or review any of our materials on it as well, and then follow up if you have additional questions.
I did
And then lastly,
put a link to the assistance animal guide in the Q&A, but I'll look for the training and post that as well.
Oh, thanks, Liz. And then lastly, no fees or deposits should be charged for any accommodation or modification. Unless, sorry, I should note, if you don't receive federal funding, you can have the person pay for the modification. I should note that, sorry. And then we're going to talk about what is reasonable. So oftentimes these requests, it's called a reasonable accommodation, a reasonable modification. It's within reason. Is there an undue financial or administrative burden on the housing provider? Is it just not cost effectively, or is it just not something that, would fundamentally alter the nature of the provider's operations? A good example I often bring up is if a person cannot drive due to disability and they request that you chauffeur them around or provide some kind of transportation. Well, that will require you hiring someone, buying a bus, and, having the funds additionally to sustain a bus or some type of vehicle that would really be outside of the operations that your housing provider offers. So that wouldn't be reasonable. And then, as I mentioned, if the original request is found to be unreasonable, what are alternatives? And those must be provided. And will it effectively meet their needs? HUD refers to these processes as an interactive process. So it really should be a conversation between the housing provider and the tenant on what can work and what would work for their disability. They should really lead the conversation information on what they need because they are the person with the disability. Here are some resources additionally that you can look at on disability. And then I'm going to hand it over to Liz. We're going to do a pop quiz. I can launch that really quickly here.
All right, so we have a quick true or false. Sexual harassment is covered under fair housing law. So what do you think? Is that true or false? Give another 30, 40 seconds here. This is very, very quick. Very quick and short, and we're seeing a lot of fast responses. Okay, we'll give you another 15 seconds or so. Oh, I apologize. Some of you are not seeing the buttons to submit the answer. So sometimes Zoom is great and sometimes they're not. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and I apologize for the difficulty. Let me share the results here. 84% of you said this is true, and you are correct. Sexual harassment is covered under fair housing law. It may also be covered under other laws, depending on the circumstances, but it is certainly addressed under fair housing, as is harassment in general. And I'll have you forward the slide if you could. I know there might be a little delay. Bree, do you mind? We're multitasking here. So this is data from the National Fair Housing Alliance. This is harassment largely based on race, disability, national origin. Those tend to be the top allegations made. This National Fair Housing Alliance is a nationwide network of which we are a member of fair housing centers and fair housing organizations. We started tracking harassment back in 2006, and you can see in 2023 we had a significant spike in allegations of harassment in housing, which is prohibited by fair housing laws and fair housing guidance. So we'll take a little bit of a deeper look at this quickly. And feel free to use the Q&A for questions. We're trying to keep up with some really good questions that we've been getting. So the Fair Housing Act does prohibit coercion, intimidation, threats, or any interference with someone who's trying to exercise or enjoy their rights provided by fair housing laws. This includes someone being subjected to harassment because of their race or national origin or other protected class, especially if it's harassment that rises to the level of someone feeling that they need to leave their housing or vacate a dwelling, or that they just give up trying to buy or rent the home. They abandon their efforts to secure that dwelling due to the harassment. There are two different types of cases or standards around harassment, and one is the creation of a hostile environment. So it's a very severe and pervasive amount of harassment that rises to the level of creating a hostile environment where people don't feel safe or welcome. It also prohibits quid pro quo harassment, which we generally see in sexual harassment, where you have requests for dates or unwanted sexual relationships in return for rent discounts or not having to pay rent or for repairs to be made. So that is all prohibited under fair housing laws. It's really important to note that the liability is quite broad here as well. Owners, property management employees, agents, representatives of the property, and other tenants and residents can be held liable, especially if there's, tenants harassing other tenants. It has to be because of a protected class. So if you remember an hour ago, I mentioned, it's really important to get familiar with your protected classes. And this is one of the reasons why. We do hear about personality disputes, but if it's not tied to a protected class and it doesn't rise to these levels of like a hostile environment, unfortunately, it's not something we can pursue under fair housing. But we've got some examples here to share. So taunting and threatening a person with a mental disability, subjecting someone to pervasive racial epithets or slurs, a property management company knowing that a tenant has been repeatedly harassing another tenant because of a disability and not taking any action to stop the harassment. This includes maintenance staff not acting there. Anybody who is a representative of the housing provider who sees anything that is harassment must take action. The cases that we'll share will show if you don't take action, it's just a much larger settlement and it's more egregious. And it's so important to help people feel safe in their homes. Withholding repairs or evicting someone for because they refuse to have sex with a staff person, persistently making unwelcome and lewd comments about a resident's body, sending pervasive, unwelcome, sexually suggestive texts, or entering the tenant's apartment without invitation or permission. These are all common examples of harassment, including sexual harassment. And we do have some best practices. That is one of your handouts. So feel free to take a look at that. Quickly review here some steps that can be taken, including having an anti-harassment policy in place. If that's something that you don't have, it's probably something you want to consider, because you can then inform current residents and future residents about your policies, and it gives you a way to help hold people accountable. It's a policy violation if they harass someone, and it helps with that accountability. It also informs them that they're not allowed to do this. You want to make sure there's multiple ways for people to report or make complaints about harassment. Make sure you're attending training so you can check that off your list because you're with us here this morning, but make sure you share the information with any relevant staff who need to know about it. Make sure you take steps and measures to ensure that people who do report harassment are protected from any retaliation from any of the active parties. You have to talk to everyone to find out whether harassment is occurring, make sure they understand their fair housing rights, and you and or they could report the harassment. As we started with, housing providers do bring us fair housing issues, and we are happy to help advocate on behalf of anyone who brings us a fair housing issue. And it might be a good idea to designate a staff person specifically who handles complaints and takes action to make sure there's good compliance and moves quickly. And then we have a quick case example here. This one is pretty egregious, so I do want to warn it can be upsetting to hear about some of these things. This was a significant case out of California where the Department of Justice actually sued a maintenance worker, a rental property, on the basis of allegations for sex discrimination, sexual harassment, and retaliation. The Department of Justice also sued the owner and the building manager. So 3 parties were all held liable for this allegation. The government charged that Mr. Salazar Jr. subjected a female tenant to sexual harassment. It was severe and pervasive. It included graphic and assertive text messages, unwelcome and inappropriate physical touching. He also offered to not make her pay rent if she had sex with him. He took pictures without permission of framed print pictures of the tenant and her daughter that were up in her house. She refused to comply with his demands and complained about the behavior to the manager. In a rather unusual twist, the manager was Salazar's father, Senior. They also jointly refused to repair a major gas leak on the property in retaliation for her complaining about the sexual harassment. This caused her to not have heat, and she also couldn't use her dryer for a month, and so she moved out. That doesn't feel safe on so many levels, and certainly we understand. While she was gone, they changed the locks on her and tried to make her come back to the property in person to get her security deposit back, and she was afraid to do that, understandably so. The complaint alleged that the property owner was also vicariously liable, which is very common in these types of complaints. So that is a third party. He was also a respondent. The complaint, as we mentioned, was filed with the Department of Justice and did settle for $45,000 in damages. They all are required to get fair housing training. The owner has to develop a policy against sexual harassment for all of the properties he owns, not just this one, and hang up equal housing opportunity posters, which include information on how to file complaints. And Salazar Jr. was not to have any contact with that specific tenant ever again. And then very quickly, we'll follow up with retaliation. This is also something that is prohibited. If anybody exercises their fair housing rights, they should not then experience adverse or negative consequences. This is a case out of Kansas. Gary Adam was a tenant with vision loss that substantially limited his life activities. So legally, he's covered as a person with a disability. He rented an apartment in Topeka and had been there for a number of years. Unfortunately, while he lived there, there were numerous significant maintenance problems, including water leaks and water damage. damage, flooding, and a malfunctioning furnace and toilets. He did file complaints and entered into a conciliation agreement where it was agreed that the repairs would be made, but there continued to be serious maintenance issues. So he tried through complaints to get the repairs handled. The property was sold and a new owner came on, but didn't take care of these serious maintenance issues. So Adam sued all apartments, alleging that the discrimination was on the basis of his disability and that they failed to make accommodations for him. They retaliated against him, and then he utilized state law, tenant landlord law as well. The judge dismissed his case as disability discrimination, as he didn't establish that the behavior was tied to the disability, but he did rule that he was retaliated against for filing a fair housing complaint with HUD due to his requests being consistently ignored. So, it is illegal to retaliate against someone who does file a fair housing complaint. So very important to be aware of that and not go through those actions. So a quick poll here. See if I can get that launched. The last one here. Every maintenance request must be addressed in the order it was received. True or false? This seems simple, but isn't. And then we'll quickly review some best practices. Make sure you stay online to get the evaluation link to complete the survey so that we can take attendance. And we welcome some questions as we wrap up as well. I will give about 15 more seconds here. I have a little bit more of a split opinion on this one. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share our results here. These are anonymous, remember? 79% of you said this is false. And while it may seem counterintuitive, I agree. It really depends on the unique circumstances of the request. And we certainly understand that there may be emergency requests that go to the front of the line, so to speak. And there also may be disability-related needs that need to be addressed quickly in order for someone to fully use and enjoy the housing that they are paying for. So great job there. In terms of best practices, just a quick reminder of things that you can do and some things that we hope you take away based on your time with us this morning. It's important to know your responsibilities under fair housing law, making sure you're keeping up with the changes. Of course, we mentioned we have some new protections here in Michigan. There's also more than 40 cities here in the state of Michigan that have local fair housing ordinances that add to the list of protections. For example, I believe in the city of Ann Arbor, they've got about 22 protected classes. So really important to do that homework. So make sure you know who your protections are. Make sure you treat all residents equally. It's important to resist the urge to provide preferential treatment to some residents, as those who don't get that type of treatment may feel that they're being discriminated against. And as we said very early on, it's anybody can file a fair housing complaint based on how they feel they were treated. And so that's why we really train from a conservative point of view and really try to help focus on equal treatment under the law. So if a resident you don't know very well asks you to help with a simple repair, and your policy is that everything has to be in writing for those kinds of requests, so you tell her to do that. If the next day another resident you know well, talk to in the lobby, they ask you to tighten a loose gasket on the sink, and you do that without asking him to submit the written request, the first resident may feel that she was treated differently and held to a different standard. It's important, as we just discussed, to process maintenance orders in requests in the order they were received, except for emergencies. This way you can show that you didn't pass over earlier requests for a discriminatory reason. It's really important to communicate with residents throughout the process, especially in the accommodations and modifications area. Communication is really key. But any delays in orders for necessary equipment, keeping in touch on when delivery might be expected or installation is expected to be scheduled, having people know what's happening, I think will eliminate some of the risk of them feeling like they're not being treated equally or being taken seriously. And again, that's especially true with accommodations and modifications. Written policies, we've said multiple times, I think this morning, right, Bree, that we recommend written policies. People need to know how to respond to requests. Residents need to know what to expect. You need to document how requests are made and how they're handled. This is really important because sometimes what is up on its surface a routine maintenance request might actually be tied to a disability as an accommodation or modification. Simple things like moving the location of a light fixture or a switch, lowering the towel rack in the bathroom. If it's disability related, that needs to be handled very carefully and communicated well. So I think we've said quite a bit about this, but recognizing and making sure that accommodation and modification requests are addressed is really key. Especially on the hammer and nail modification sides of things, that may be something that comes to your team first. And so everybody needs to recognize that if somebody mentions a health condition or a need because of a diagnosis or a change in their health, or they have a disability, regardless of how they say it, if they ask for something to be done because of that, you need to recognize that it may be a modification or accommodation. It may be related to a disability under law, and therefore it needs to be handled specifically under that guidance and handled in a timely way. A lot of judges over many, many cases over the years have said, multiple delays or simply not responding is not acceptable, and that violates fair housing law. So recognize and prioritize these requests, take action, and document that. Of course, we want to take steps to prevent sexual harassment, providing that education, having those policies in place, making sure that if it happens, it is identified and quickly addressed, and document all the steps taken, of course, to address it is really important. We caution fraternization with any residents. Of course, you want to be professional and friendly, keep lines of communication open, but you don't want to take communication too far. It can be misinterpreted and open up to risk. If you invite a tenant out to lunch, it might make them feel uncomfortable. So it's best to stick to professional relationships and provide that service in a professional light. And of course, you want to be communicative and friendly, but that's as far as you want to go. Also use caution with allowing yourself to be in compromising positions. Sometimes a circumstance that seems appropriate isn't, or the circumstances change in the middle of your morning. And so it's important to recognize this and know when to leave a situation. If a resident comes to the door inappropriately dressed and invites you in, it's improper to go inside even though you've been invited. Same thing if they are maybe not sober. If they're not together, it's best to decline the invitation and offer to come back at a more appropriate time. Of course, you want to inform management and document what happened. Date it, initial it, maintain those records. It's best to respect residents' privacies, of course. Residents value privacy in our homes. It's a safe place, so it's important that they don't feel that this has been violated. It's best not to comment on items in the apartment. Focus on being polite, doing the work, thanking them, and leaving, especially if you initiate a conversation about something and it turns out to have religious or cultural significance. That could create fair housing risk. It could be fine, could not be, so it's best to avoid it. Think about accessibility. This is often things like not allowing snow or trash to be piled up in access aisles next to disability or accessible focused parking spots, making sure that curb cuts, walkways, electronic doors, buttons that open doors, all those spaces need to be kept clear and clean to uphold access. This is a great website that you can learn a little bit more about accessibility on, fairhousingfirst.org. Always focus on describing the property, not the people that live there. So this is important in terms of communication is broadly defined and covered over the Fair Housing Act. So making sure that you avoid references to protected classes and only focus on the property, the services, the amenities, things like that is a good best practice to follow. And then if you are using outside contractors, you want to be aware that there's some level of liability there for vendors and contractors that you utilize. So it's important to know that they are good practitioners, that they attend fair housing training. You can have that conversation, document their engagement, make sure they understand their obligations so that it doesn't reflect on you. And keep good records. Record keeping is critical. And as we mentioned, we want you to see in the state of Michigan that you keep all records for at least 3 years. You can keep them for longer, but we don't recommend having anything less. We have a wonderful website, our resource archive. You can search by topic, protected class, by language. You can search. So we encourage you to check that out. All of these blue links in your handouts that you received by email should be clickable and take you exactly where you want to go. We have lots of resources on different topics, as you can see, from senior housing and condos to working with families with children, lots of disability-based resources, guidebooks on how to handle accommodations and modifications. We have HUD guidance, you name it, you can find it on our website. And then we have more trainings coming up. Our next one is going to focus on senior housing, and that will take place in May. We will also be doing another series of 101, 201, and 301 trainings for rental professionals starting in June. And we're very excited. Fair Housing Month starts next week for April, and we are doing an online conference, and you can register now for our April 24th afternoon conference. We'll have 3 different workshops, one of which will focus on the new source of income protections, and one of which will have some legal case updates with continuing education credits for realtors. And then just very briefly, I want to highlight there's a link in the chat. Each individual separately must complete this evaluation in order to verify their attendance and receive a certificate. If you don't individually complete the survey by the end of the day tomorrow, we cannot guarantee that you'll get a certificate. We have to have this information verifying your attendance. We need to know what your name is, and we also need to know the right address of where you want us to send the certificate. It will take us at least 6 weeks, so please be patient with us. We've had hundreds and hundreds of people on our trainings, which is great, but we also want to make sure that we get that information out. And so you do need to complete those surveys individually. So please get that link from the chat, and we will also follow up with an email for that to you later today. And I think we will pause for any questions.